Let's take a little brief look at the history of DOS. Of course, DOS is a disk operating system, and you need a disk operating system for these new microprocessors that came along. The 4004 was the first microprocessor. It really did not go into any computers per se. It might have gone into some high-end desktop electronic calculators and that kind of thing. It wasn't until the 8080, a successor of the 4004, came out that we finally began to use them in personal computers. This was 4 years later. Since then there had been a 4040, but now the 8080 was used in the very first personal computer, the Altair 8800. Now we needed at this point an operating system, and so by the way, there were no disks in this thing, so you didn't call it a disk operating system by any means. We had this control program for microcomputers, I believe it's, or maybe microprocessor, control program for microprocessors, written by Gary Kildall, and that was what was used on the 8080. Well, eventually Intel came up with some analogs of the 8080, the first one being the 8085. That 5 simply means that this was an all 5-volt chip, whereas there were some 12-volt lines on the 8080. This one used all 5-volt lines, so that was quite an improvement. And during this development time by Intel, another company came along called Zilog. Zilog, which is still around by the way, created a chip called the Z80, which was an 8080 clone, except for one interesting thing. It had about 80 more commands in its instruction set. So that means that it became very popular, became the predominant chip at the time, and was compatible with anything for the 8080. This ended up in many popular machines at the time, most notably the TRS-80 by Radio Shack. The one you're looking at here actually has this extra box here. The original one, the computer's in the keyboard, and it had 4 kilobytes of memory. This extra box held some additional memory and brought this thing up to 16 kilobytes of RAM. Tim Mann then took the CP/M language and wrote a Z80 version of it, which he now called TRIS-DOS. Well, eventually the 8086 was introduced in July 1978. The 8086 now had a much larger instruction set than even the Z80, so it now took predominance in the industry, and was written, and was incorporated into many personal computers of the time. Well, again, now we needed a new operating system for this new chip that had this new capability in it, and so a man named Tim Patterson wrote an operating system for it. Now, remember, there were still no disks in these machines at this point. And so DOS here does not mean disk operating system. I'll get to that in a moment. But he wrote in about 6 weeks' time a CP/M look-alike for the 86 processor. He called it QDOS, and then later changed it to 86DOS. Now, I said this does not mean disk operating system because we didn't even have disks yet. No, it actually meant quick and dirty operating system, and that's what QDOS stood for. And then the 86 dirty operating system, I guess you might say. Well, in the meantime, Microsoft had already been formed. Now, Microsoft's first product was not an operating system at all. It was a program compiler for the Altair 8800. And so here we have Paul Allen and Bill Gates, who wrote that compiler for the Altair 8800 and had already formed Microsoft, although at the time it had a dash in it. It was actually Micro-Soft in 1975. Well, eventually they hired Tim Patterson and bought his 86DOS from him for $75,000. And then, since they hired him at the same time, they had him do some more work on it, and eventually released it as MS-DOS, or Microsoft DOS. So here Microsoft now owned Microsoft DOS, and they licensed it out on a non-exclusive license agreement with IBM. And when they did that, they renamed it, or at least I don't know if they did it or if IBM did it, but it was renamed to PC-DOS. Now MS-DOS still existed. The PC-DOS was just the version that went into the IBM PC, the first PC line of computers. And in the meantime, Microsoft then went on to license MS-DOS to about 60 other companies all at the same time, since it was a non-exclusive agreement. So that's pretty much the history of DOS. Now that we had MS-DOS, we could write a command line with a command line. And by the way, this is about the same time that disks began to come into vogue, and so now we call it the disk operating system. And so Microsoft was one of the first, although certainly not the first, to come up with that operating system.